So it's 10 a.m. So I think we'll begin the next session. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Staudinger. I'm currently serving as a partnership ecologist with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, on detail from my usual role as science coordinator. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this morning's discussion panel, Pressing Management Challenges in Climate Adaptation. I'd like to start by going over the session's goals. We have designed the session to showcase multiple CASC partner perspectives with management responsibilities that seek to adapt, conserve, and protect natural and cultural resources over different jurisdictions, spatial and time scales in the Northeast region. The session also seeks to discuss current challenges and opportunities to implementing climate adaptation actions at different scales in the Northeast, and to communicate potential intersections for scientists, managers, and traditional knowledge keepers to collaborate and coordinate on regional climate adaptation initiatives. So I'd like to now introduce our four panelists. I will introduce each panelist, and I've asked them to each briefly speak to their organization's specific role and responsibilities and the scales at which they manage natural and cultural resources and integrate climate change information. So I think we'll start off with Jerry Pardilla, Director of the United Southern and Eastern Tribes. Jerry, good morning.
Good morning.
Could you please speak just briefly to your organization's specific role and responsibilities and the scales at which you manage natural and cultural?
Very good. United Southern Eastern Tribes is an intertribal consortium of tribal nations from the Northeast woodlands down the mid-Atlantic to and across the Gulf of Mexico. And my work is in the Department of the Office of Environmental Resource Management. I am the director and have been with the organization since 2012. Our work spans a number of program areas, and for the purposes of our work here, we have an emphasis on climate adaptation. Our work is carried out through the liaison work of Dr. Cathy Thornbrew. We have a memorandum of understanding with both the Northeast and the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Centers.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Next, I'd like to introduce Valerie Hipkins, Assistant Regional Director for the Northeast U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Good morning, Valerie.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Michelle. I'll speak a little bit to our agency perspective here with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then a little bit more about our kind of footprint in the Northeast region. And so from an agency perspective, this last year has been a bit of an opportunity for us to re-engage, I would say, as a federal agency in the climate science area. And both in what our needs are in climate science, but also who our partners are and the connections and links between all of us. But at the same token, for the agency, there's a strong commitment and an awareness of the need to address these complex conservation challenges at a landscape scale. Also with, of course, a realization of going from species to landscapes is needed. As we move forward on wildlife conservation of species that are at risk, or even a recovery of listed species, having a firm partnership and collaboration and awareness of landscape scale concepts is what is going to help us drive toward our wildlife conservation goals. And one of the recent accomplishments of the agency is to have newly produced a climate change action program document. And that is providing a bit of framework for us to start this re-engagement in this area. And it has 7 components to it. and everything from developing a conservation adaptation strategy to increasing our literacy within the workforce to connecting to climate science to our highest conservation priorities, just as an example. And from a regional perspective, we have some strong regional goals here of at-risk species conservation. So helping to change the trajectory of species that aren't doing well, that are not yet listed, and by changing conservation actions, improving conservation actions that will protect them from the need for listing under the Endangered Species Act. Aquatic connectivity is a second here in the region, and coastal resilience. And so all three of those issues, of course, are so dependent on strong climate, an understanding of climate science and climate adaptation and mitigation issues. So from a regional perspective, those are some really strong goals for us. And then I think the last is really, again, to be putting a lot of attention on large landscape conservation, through collaborations and identifying shared information. So for us, I believe we're going to be spending a lot of time really thinking about those climate adaptation actions that we have been taking that we would like to continue, and looking for where we need to be doing things differently in the future.
Thank you so much, Valerie. Next, I'd like to introduce Marc Albert, Director of Natural Resource Partnerships for the National Parks of Boston. Good morning, Marc.
Morning, Michelle. Thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. So the National Parks of Boston includes Boston African American National Historic Site, Boston National Historic Park, and the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park. Collectively, these parks protect and provide visitor access to a huge range of cultural and natural resources and their stories around Boston, including the USS Constitution and the Charlestown Navy Yard, where she's located, the Bunker Hill Monument, the incredible Augustus St. Gaudens sculpture at the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial, which honors the first all-Black regiment of the Civil War, and many, many layers of natural and cultural history contained on the 30 Boston Harbor Islands, including a 19-island National Register archaeological district associated with thousands of years of creations from the Massachusetts and other Native American tribes. There are other national park units around the Boston area as well, but at the National Parks of Boston, we're focused on Boston Harbor, sort of the Boston Harbor, and a network of sites in urban Boston, including the Charlestown waterfront. The mission of the Park Service is common to a lot of conservation agencies, which is preserve resources and provide enjoyment of those resources for the public, for sort of all future generations of the public. And yet in the National Parks of Boston, all of these parks are partnerships. Unlike many national parks, the National Park Service owns very little of the land, water, or resources of the National Parks of Boston. We are primarily there as sort of a partnership coordinator for the most part, although we do own some of the things. This brings challenges in that we don't get to decide what happens, but also a lot of opportunities, because climate adaptation is no job for just one landowner or one partner, and having our role be explicitly one of partnership development and management, I think helps us engage a broader network to solve these collective challenges. We do bring a conservation planning focus and technical expertise to these partnerships, as well as some federal funding. And we have certainly dramatically increased our focus on ocean, coastal, and climate science at the scale of the harbor. And I would say that the majority of my time has shifted towards planning and coordinating studies and management of park resources in the context of sort of coastal climate adaptation. Last thing I'll say is that the Harbor Islands were named as one of the 11 most endangered historic places this year by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So this meeting and the existence of the Climate Adaptation Science Centers is very well timed, and I really look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marc. Next, I'd like to introduce Cathy Haffner, Chair of the Northeast State Wildlife Action Plan Coordinator Subcommittee. Cathy?
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am a Pennsylvania Game Commission wildlife biologist and wildlife diversity conservation planning coordinator, but I'm participating today on behalf of the Northeastern State Wildlife Action Plan coordinators as chair of the Wildlife Action Plan Coordinator Subcommittee. And this is under our Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Fish and Wildlife Diversity Technical Committee. So I just want to thank all of my colleagues in the states who contributed to preparing me for this discussion today. If you're not familiar with wildlife action plans, there's statewide comprehensive science-based voluntary conservation blueprints for species of greatest conservation need. They are in every state and US territory, and they're required by the Fish and Wildlife Service to receive federal, state, and tribal wildlife grants funding. So they're developed in concert with many statewide partners and the public, and all plans are reviewed and approved by the Fish and Wildlife Service to ensure they adequately meet 8 required elements. And this is from species to habitat associations, threats such as climate change, conservation actions, monitoring needs, research and survey needs as well. They're updated every 10 years. So we're just launching into a revision cycle now. We do this collectively across the Northeast. So the first plans were published in 2005, and they really serve as a foundation for the collective action at the regional scale. The Northeast states have a long history of working together, decades old history. And leading into the 2015 revisions of the plans, the Northeast states worked together to develop ways to facilitate rolling up this information, such as developing a common language that enabled a wildlife action plan database that's available to anybody through the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, or NEAFWA for short, website. And it also helps us to analyze all of the wildlife action plan information across the states. Through this, we've identified 358 regional species of greatest conservation need and common threats, actions, research and survey needs. And a lot of this will be covered in option 2, I believe, in the next session, where they'll be talking about regional threats and vulnerability assessments. So tune into that if you want to hear more. But specific to climate change, nationally, it's voluntary to include in wildlife action plans. However, again, going into the 2015 revisions, the Fish and Wildlife Service Northeast region had required climate change to be addressed in as a threat. And so we had many resources to help us accomplish this, including a 2009 Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies voluntary guidance for incorporating climate change into action plans. And this is actually currently being updated for, in advance of the 2025 versions. And the CASC was especially helpful to us because Michelle and her team led a synthesis of the Northeast climate science and adaptation strategies that we can think about for our wildlife action plans. So this was very, very helpful. We're thrilled to be partners with CASC and really appreciate the work you do and appreciate being part of this important discussion.
Thanks so much, Cathy, for the kind words. And again, I just wanted to thank all 4 of our panelists today for participating in this discussion and sharing their thoughts. So for the rest of our time today, we're going to work through 3 questions that the panelists and I co-produced prior to today's discussion. And I'm going to ask each panelist to speak their answer. They'll have 3 minutes. If you hear some music, that's me just kind of giving the timing cue. So if the audience hears some music, that's what's happening there. Then we'll move on to the next speaker. So we have 3 questions. We'll go round robin. I'll read each question and then put the question in the chat. for everyone's reference, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen while we're going around the panel so everybody can see who's talking. So our first question today is, over what scales and how do you select and use climate science to inform management actions? And I'd like to start with Jerry.
Thank you. Thank you. So the scales that we consider are really complex, and I mean that in that it extends beyond the present day tribal boundaries and our political boundaries. They go very much to the ancestral territories, and so it's very complicated. So we can overlay political boundaries over those territories, but we have millennia of experience in our Aboriginal homelands. And so the complications today are based around something that I'll call land tenure. So we have our lands that are held in trust by the federal government. Those are very much our present day reservation lands that may be the legacy of our treaties, but also the land that may be taken into trust by the United States government on our behalf. So our land tenure is both trust lands, but more broadly our Aboriginal territory. And then we have two scales, very broad and then micro. The broad scales break down into subregions, and for our conversation today, the Northeast Woodlands. But in the United South and Eastern Tribes region, we also have the Atlantic Seaboard and down to the Gulf of Mexico. And then the micro scales include very specific tribal nation homelands. And for instance, my own tribal background of Penobscot Indian Territory, which is more broadly in the land of the Wabanaki, often said by English speakers as Wabanaki, but Wabanaki is our territory. And so there's both very broad scales, micro scales, and looking at the impacts of climate change, both on a very fixed boundary location that may be a reservation held in trust by the United States government, and how that fits into our broader understanding of our territories and the connections in our Aboriginal homelands. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jerry. Before I go to Val for her response, I just wanted to also mention that after we go through the three questions, we have reserved time to take questions from the audience. If you would like to submit a question or a comment, you can do so through the Q&A button in the Zoom, and then I will, as time allows, I will go through those questions and pose them to the panelists, and we may also be able to respond to them written through the chat as well. Valerie.
Thanks. I was wondering what music you were going to choose, Michelle. So I'm glad to get a teaser for it. Same with Jerry. We really focus in on different scales for different reasons, and that's both spatial and temporal. So both depending on the geographic area of interest, also based on the time scale that we're interested in. And it really is a match of what our goals are. I think that then dictate what scale we want to be at. It's going to then dictate which partners that we are speaking to and working with together. And that then also links directly to the science we need. And I can't stress this one enough. I've just found over the course of my career, and definitely here in the Fish and Wildlife Service as well, matching the science producers to the science users is so critical. And so when we are trying to determine, and usually it is always collectively with multiple organizations and partners, people who care about that land and that resource, what are those shared conservation goals that we have, and making sure that there's articulation of the correct scale, again, over space and time, because that is then, I think, where you can find the correct science, because you want your science to be targeted specifically to those ultimate conservation goals that are therefore scale dependent. So I am going to stop there because I don't want to have the music play for me.
Thank you, Valerie. Next, we'll go to Marc.
I like that if we go too long, we get to sort of pretend that we're winning an Oscar or something. Yeah, so I'd say the short answer for me is that we work at a scale between highly local, being sort of a park management agency, we are focused on parks, and regional, whether that be the eroding earthworks that are part of the Fort Warren National Historic Landmark on George's Island, or the broader socio-ecological system of the Boston area, or sort of ecologically the Gulf of Maine ecosystem. And generally we look for, we turn to science on a project to project basis rather than within an overall strategic approach. That's not, there are plenty of folks in the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior and our sister agencies that are moving us in a strategic approach. I'm just reflecting sort of what I see from my park perspective. And I'd say that a bit of a longer answer has to do with the fact that the Park Service and I believe sort of sister agencies and institutions are in a moment of reckoning with management policy directives. On the one hand, the Department of the Interior and the National Park Service have issued recent orders that direct us to incorporate climate projections in all of our planning. And it's long been our policy that we're supposed to use best available science to make management decisions. And those things tell us that change is inevitable and that preservation and conservation planning must allow for a range of future conditions with a lot of uncertainty. On the other hand, we're still dealing with the 20th century preservation policy framework that was based on a sort of strict preservation focus. The primary guidance for natural area conservation was to, quote, preserve vignettes of primitive America, unquote, in the mid 20th century. In other words, just putting a boundary around a natural feature and preserving the so-called primitive condition. Although our policy has advanced past that and now acknowledges that change happens and directs us to take management actions to restore areas or resources that have been harmed by humans, I don't think we've yet had a management framework sort of revolution that we need to address the ubiquitous effect of human impacts. And both sides of him, even saying human impact isn't quite right, because there's a need to acknowledge the deep history of people as integrated parts of ecosystems. And the word impact doesn't make sense there. It's just living within an ecosystem. And also our current climate adaptation challenge, in which we'll need to decide what so-called desired future conditions will be, what range it will accept in a rapidly changing world. So we should select and use science within a broader strategic policy framework that's caught up to our current moment. Planning using tools such as scenario planning and having park or regional scale planning with an adaptive management approach need to be the standard for both policy and science. And I do think we're getting there, but I don't think that we're there yet. Thanks. No music.
My only problem now is that I'm having trouble restarting it, figuring out where the restart button is. So thank you so much, Marc. Cathy.
All right, now I'm definitely going to get the music, I'm sure. Well, I'll be echoing a lot of what you heard already. I'm here essentially representing the state wildlife agencies, and we are application oriented, using applied science. So the pace and breadth of climate science is really difficult, quite honestly, for us, for fish and wildlife managers to stay abreast of on a regular basis. And so, centers like CASC they're such valuable resources to us to just synthesize that information in a meaningful way for us to apply it on the ground. We're charged with managing fish, wildlife, and their habitats for this and future generations. And as you heard before, it's a balancing act of near-term conservation targets. Maybe it's protecting shorebird nests on an annual basis or setting seasonal harvest limits, but also keeping that long-term population viability in mind, and how, for example, wildlife diseases may be exacerbated by warmer and wetter future, or what is that desired future habitat condition, such as in forest management. So these are all considerations we have to think about, and for the most part, fish and wildlife managers don't have a lot of comfort thinking beyond a decade, it seems. And, except for, I guess, forestry would be an exception. They really think about like centennial scales. But, and it may be because of a comfort level with uncertainty. We know that, with the models, we're guessing to some degree how things will react. And so, we're trying to always apply the best science for the situation. So, on a day-to-day basis, when we're met with direct impacts to fish and wildlife, such as, could be turtle trafficking, or evaluating potential impacts from proposed land conversion, tackling this largely indirect, chronic, pervasive issue can get lost in the daily shuffle. So, getting back to the conservation planning frameworks, I think that's where the wildlife action plans are helpful. It provides us that opportunity to look at the issues from a temporal scale, at least for the next decade, and see what actions we can take now to set us up well for the future. One of the issues we have is determining what to do now that will set us up well for that uncertain future, and taking it beyond the no-gret strategies like reducing non-climate stressors, and where to do this, is challenging as well. So, again, this is where the Northeast collaboration is really helpful in tackling such a significant topic that has pervasive impacts. And as others have said, the scale of application is variable from local, dealing with sea level rise at a site and salt marsh migration. We can think about it on a statewide scale, from changing hydrology to snow cover. So, it's happening at the regional scale. So, it's a primary consideration, and the work that we do really aligns with healthy habitats, which is what we're always trying to manage land, manage our resources in the best way possible. So we've done work on enhancing aquatic organism passage, for example, by replacing culverts, managing forests for multiple age class and different age class diversity, etc. So it's an ongoing challenge, and we work at a variety of scales and try to strive for multiple species benefit.
Thank you, Cathy. Moving on to our second question. Recent initiatives have sought to respond to the biodiversity and climate crises through strategic and effective conservation and restoration efforts, particularly through connected landscape networks. How do you envision meeting this goal at your institution or organization for resources of interest, for example, trust and heritage resources, at-risk species, and regional species of greatest conservation need? Jerry, I think we'll go back to you to start.
Good. I hope I don't hear the music on this one, but on the first question, it's very, very, very thoughtful from my co-panelists, and a scale that came to my mind was really a very long-term scale. And so tribal ecological knowledge or cultural knowledge have stories of millennia. And so those are lessons that we carry with us. However, there are challenges with fixed boundaries. So we have stories of a great flood and at Penobscot, and I think about the isostatic rebound and the sea level and shoreline changes due to the rising of the land, and how at a time there was an inland flooding on the lower part of what we know is the present day Penobscot watershed, and our people moved to higher ground, and so we have flooding stories, and that was the case where we could move in our ancestral territory to adapt to the changes. And so just to follow up with our conversations about fixed locations, and how I identify so well with Marc's comments about the parks are very sub-regional or fixed areas. So a lot of convergence of concerns there. So to the second question, I hope I have enough time just to hit some highlights, and that we might have time for conversation. But with connecting landscapes and watershed tributaries, I think about my own home river and the dams that were removed a number of years ago, and how fish ladders were improved for migratory passage of diadromous species. So both, well, and how restoring those migratory routes have been so tremendous, not only for my people, but for the whole ecosystems and those important species that are part of a healthy ecosystem. And so connecting those landscapes and watershed tributaries are so very important. Also, I'm thinking about maintaining or protecting our key and cultural economic species and habitats. So I think about the well-known ash tree and the emerald ash borer that has been well studied and spoken about, but that's an important consideration, how to deal with those changes. And then with, say, the maple trees and the effect of climate change on the ranges of maple trees, and what that may mean for the economies that come from sugar bush and maple syrup production. How do we maintain and protect those key cultural and economic species and habitats for those kinds of cultural and economic activities? And then monitoring species range shifting. So as I hear from my colleague, Dr. Casey Thornbrew, about the famous Cape cod, but yet the cod are in decline in their historical ranges. And new species such as the sea bass are moving into those vacated ranges. And also the migration of blue crabs into the Gulf of Maine. So these migrations and range shifts are those that we need to continue to monitor. And then the last point is looking at large scale pollutant discharges, non-point sources, such as nitrogen entering into the coastal waterways. And this high nitrogen contributes to algal blooms that affect shellfish, not only for the sake of the shellfish, but for all of us that have shellfish in our diets. So we need to have a clean landscape and seascape going forward, and to take measures to ensure that. So I'll conclude there. So thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Next, we'll hear from Valerie.
Thank you. The connected land and waters for us is where our focus really is, because it's through connected lands and waters that we feel we can be making accomplishments for our conservation goals, both for wildlife diversity, habitat diversity, cultural heritage outcomes, environmental justice outcomes, but all achievable through connected lands and waters. So, and I think, this actually touches a bit on the scale question from before. So as we think about connected lands and waters, it's for different purposes at times, or we can do different things with that knowledge. So, at a regional scale, or even beyond the region, I think those scales are particularly useful and helpful when we are for our understanding of all of these complex systems that interact, helpful for developing strategy, and also for implementation or a strategy that's going to get us to implementation. So more prioritizing really our efforts. So understanding strategy and prioritization at these larger scales. And then as we think about these connected lands and waters at more local scales, that's when we can be more thoughtful about decision-making and implementation, because decisions are easier to conduct at smaller scales than they are larger scales, but they are all woven together. And I think too, when, as I mentioned earlier as well, and Cathy covered it, you know, our interest in at-risk species and RSGCN is very strong. And when regional species of greatest conservation need, RSGCN. So to weave that framework of a coordinated effort from the SWAPs into connected lands and waters and design and outputs of conservation goals is where we'd really like to get to. And I do want to mention, you know, America the Beautiful, because it kind of fits in this category. And as most folks know, you know, the administration came out with what was called 30 by 30 at the early stage of the administration, you know, protecting 30% of our nation's lands and waters by 2030. And it was very controversial, and and there was a lot of concern about that, of trying to, the concern was that the federal government was going to be trying to put more lands into federal protected class. And that's shifted, if folks have noticed, not 30 by 30 any longer, but it was really a rethinking and a re-imaging of what the true intent was. And it's called America the Beautiful now, which is really a vision. It's a goal or a vision that we can think collectively and work across land ownerships and jurisdictions and geographical areas to achieve connected lands and waters. So it's a much more proactive, voluntary coming together, you know, across all of these lands, where we can collectively contribute to some of these shared goals. So I think America the Beautiful captures better what we are thinking about, even within the service in this region, about connected lands and waters as a means to conservation. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Valerie. We've had thank you for speaking to America the Beautiful and 30 by 30. We've had a couple of questions come in the Q&A that have asked for more elaboration. So I'm glad we've covered that. And assuming we have time at the end of the program, we'll be able to work through some of those questions that are coming in. So again, for folks who may have joined a little late, if you have a question that you'd like to direct to the panel, we're going to finish working through question 2 and then do a third question, and then we'll take questions through from the audience, and you can submit those through the Q&A. Marc, would you like to speak to question 2 next, please?
Sure. You know, at the park level, we do have to focus primarily on the sort of resources of the park. So our networks do tend to primarily be local, you know, in terms of day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year planning. We do have at the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park sort of a built-in landscape stewardship network, because the law that created the Boston Harbor Islands as a unit of the National Park Service back in 1996 also created what's called the Boston Harbor Islands Partnership, which sort of brings the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the City of Boston, 3 major nonprofits, and some other agencies together, along with a public advisory board, to help sort of define help shape planning and management in collaboration for the Harbor Islands. You know, within the regional scale, the Harbor Islands is still a very sort of local level, but it's a good model, I think. That given, I would say that resource conservation and climate adaptation for the Boston Harbor Islands Partnership generally takes a backseat to recreation planning and visitor planning. You know, there's sort of I think a drive to, like, more visitors equals better park, kind of simple algorithm where from a resource manager's perspective, I don't think that's necessarily our only key metric. And I think more of a regional effort would help bring the science and stewardship needs more to the fore. And I do think that's starting to happen. Certainly we're fortunate in that the city of Boston and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts are, I think, very aligned with the current federal administration in terms of climate adaptation and climate science as priorities. So we have a good context for that, sort of making this more of a regional effort, at least within the Massachusetts. One other positive thing that I wanted to mention is that the National Park Service and the United States Navy have begun partnering with the city of Boston's Climate Ready Boston planning effort up at the Charlestown Navy Yard. The Climate Ready Boston is pretty cool effort where they are they're developing neighborhood by neighborhood sort of coastal flood adaptation planning plans to try to develop solutions that will protect from coastal flooding while also providing social or economic co-benefits. And the Park Service and the U.S. Navy work together at the Navy Yard to manage those resources. And this effort is really just beginning at a sort of district scale for us. But through this process, I've come to understand that the Navy manages more coastal assets than any other entity in the United States. And they are taking climate adaptation seriously. I only have a very local and small window into this, but it does seem that perhaps the Navy could be much more of a partner than might seem immediately obvious, because they're part of the military in terms of these, what might need to be larger scale adaptation efforts in coastal areas. And last thing I'll say is, I do think we would benefit at sort of being in a park is sometimes a bit siloed from what's happening at regional, national levels and with other agencies, et cetera. And we would certainly benefit from more of a community of practice around science and stewardship, and particularly science and stewardship. Sometimes there's science groups doing great stuff and sort of management happens a little bit in its own bubble. But the connection between the two is really where it's all at. Science is the sort of use of science is sort of why we're doing this. So one model I've seen that others are familiar with is the California Landscape Stewardship Network. They've seemingly organized very well around creating this community practice that touches on all of these things. I know they're also pushing for policy changes, for example, to allow for proposed projects in coastal areas that might be ecologically beneficial to have a different sort of policy track within the state, in this case, than projects that are typical sort of coastal development projects. So that's potentially a model that we could look at for our region or others. Thanks.
Thank you, Marc. Cathy, would you like to round us out on this second question?
Sure. Yeah, so, this is a big topic, so I feel like I'm just going to be skimming the surface here, but, landscape connectivity and resiliency are really top of mind for the northeastern states. And at the end of the day, we're always focused on good stewardship of our trust resources that we manage. So, we're fortunate to have really great analysis, really great spatial analyses available from through the NEAFWA geography, which I should have mentioned is Maine to Virginia. And we've supported some of this work with state wildlife grants. We pool the funding percentage of our allocations into a regional conservation needs grant program. So for example, we partially supported the Nature Conservancy's resiliency analysis work. And we've also partnered with Fish and Wildlife Service on Nature's Network, which has identified core and connecting landscapes for regional species of greatest conservation need, and that'll be updated in the future. So, some of this work has been downscaled at the state level, and approaches across states vary, in terms of open space and connectivity. But, it's from the conservation to plan, conservation planning to action perspectives, but just some quick highlights, states in the Northern Appalachian and Acadian region, which is Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, are part of a Staying Connected initiative, and that's seeking to conserve and enhance landscape connectivity across the region. We've got Rhode Island working to restore coastal systems for marsh migration and stream connectivity, and trying to steer renewable energy projects to the already degraded habitat rather than impacting existing habitat. Connecticut has a green plan that outlines an actual percentage for open space. New Jersey has its own connectivity, terrestrial connectivity tool. And, in Pennsylvania, our Fish and Boat Commission has been working on removing, resizing culverts, removing low head dams, et cetera. Virginia has been engaging partners throughout and using Conserve Virginia that has identified unprotected lands for conserving biodiversity. So additionally, many of the states, pretty much all of us, are leveraging the priority landscapes identified by the Atlantic Coast and Appalachian Mountain joint ventures. And so there are a variety of tactics that we employ. Again, we've been working as a collaborative and using our state wildlife action plans as foundational documents. The Northeast State Wildlife Action Plan coordinators focused one of our monthly calls on connectivity, and we're looking forward to pursuing this topic further into the future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cathy. So many great viewpoints. I'm so glad that so many of your colleagues, SWAP colleagues, gave you those great talking points to share with us. So thank you so much. So our third and final question is framed because in the spirit of Halloween, which of course is coming up later this week, this is our Ghostbusters question. Who are you going to call? So the third question is, who do you call or consult for climate science assistance? What capacity do you have in-house versus what you would anticipate asking for outside assistance and collaboration on? And we'll go back to Jerry to answer first.
Good morning again. I think about this in two strategies. One is engaging current climate experts, those that we have in our tribal programs, and at USET we have our climate scientists and interns, and also with federal agencies and university programs. So again, engaging our current climate experts. And then secondly, supporting tribal youth and the next generation of tribal scientists to respond to climate change. This is a multi-generational phenomenon. And so we are looking to the next generations. So I'll conclude there.
Awesome, Jerry, thank you so much. Val, would you like to go next?
I will, Michelle, and I hesitate to fess up to this, but I am going to fess up to this, is that I feel sometimes just buried under the sheer weight of everybody who is involved in climate science and kind of wading through where to go. And that comes from a perspective of, I spent over 20 years with the Forest Service research. I'm actually a geneticist where we talk all the time about climate impacts and so very, very in tune to that. And here in the Fish and Wildlife Service, climate. So it's been part of my professional life, and I still feel sometimes overwhelmed with again, just all of the resources that are available. So, who am I going to call? I think the way I've been approaching it is trying to get very centered with whatever role I'm in about what is it I'm trying to accomplish. What am I really trying to do, and then start reaching out to achieve that goal. Because we do have, if it's research, sometimes I need research, and so forecasting, planning, quite a number of genetic implications for species. And so then go to like the CASC system, the USA climate hubs, USGS and Forest Service scientists, university scientists, NGOs. I mean, there's a huge body of folks who are excellent at conducting research, if I can define very clearly what it is I need. Science training is another piece, you know, and because I don't think any of us, and certainly in our federal government agencies I've been a part of, we don't have the capacity to build all these pieces ourselves. So we have to rely on others. And I want to always do that a bit strategically if I can. So can we get science training from another source? Can we get science interpretation somewhere? That's a big one, I think, for us. Can we get climate science almost translated? Specifically like into our species status assessments, into our landscape conservation designs, into our land acquisition plans, into our nature-based infrastructure projects that we want to prioritize to achieve specific goals. So, you know, reaching out for different purposes for all of those reasons. But people have all been talking about this, you know, linking those tools and that science to implementation. That is, I think, if anything, that's where internally we are I think most about. Can we be the linkers to all of that information, to implementation, in our context, ultimately, you know, for wildlife conservation. Which is habitat and landscape conservation as well. So thanks, I'll stop.
Great, thank you, Valerie. Certainly in my normal day job as science coordinator, making all those links and trying to find all those different partners and asking the right people the right questions to get the right resources is certainly overwhelming. So you're certainly not alone. Marc, would you like to go next?
Sure, try to be quick so there's some time for Q&A. But Valerie, I think you explained it really well, that the challenge of sort of who you're going to call everyone, you know, that's sort of how it feels a little bit. That given, you know, we do have, the Park Service does have a climate change response program, and staff, including our coastal landscape adaptation coordinator, Amanda Babson, who's a super important liaison and collaborator. The Park Service has a scientist in parks, in professional sort of high level internship program, which does help with that training, you know, sort of, you know, a couple dozen at a time each year, working across various parks. So I think that's very helpful to develop that next generation of scientists who have this as their framework, this sort of climate adaptation as their framework. We use annual funding calls to get most of the actual sort of dedicated science happening in parks. And that's, we have currently 3 projects ongoing, you know, related to modeling and mapping coastal vulnerability for the harbor islands, which I hope will be a very, we will work with science communicators to bring it to managers so that we can try to bridge that gap that you were talking about, Valerie. And then the last thing I want to say is we work really hard to develop partnerships that are outside of the, you know, federal world. And the most exciting effort that's happening now in Boston Harbor, I'd say, in this realm is the Stone Living Lab, which was just formed maybe just over a year ago now. It's a partnership dedicated to bringing nature-based solutions for coastal climate resilience at full scale, testing them at full scale in Boston Harbor, and engaging the public in the challenge of living with a changing coast. And part of the goal there is also to promote equitable benefits, not just benefits for sort of the rich developers who can afford it in, you know, the Seaport District of Boston. And the partnership establishes Boston Harbor and the islands as sort of a living laboratory. It's not a lab building, it's a living lab, and brings the Park Service into a formal partnership around these topics with the City of Boston, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, University of Massachusetts at Boston, and Boston Harbor Now, which is a nonprofit that promotes sort of smart waterfront growth and community engagement. So that's sort of the biggest thing that's happening at this partnership level for us right now. But yeah, there's sort of too much and not enough both at the same time. I think Valerie, you did a great job explaining that.
Thank you, Marc. Yeah, certainly we're all gonna have to work across boundaries and really think about how to partner with each other equitably and use each other's strengths to tackle these issues. Cathy.
Thanks. Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say with the states. You know, we have very limited in-house capacity. Some states do have some capacity, but for the most part, it's very limited. And so external sources of applied information are highly valued, such as CASC and the translational research that you provide to, you know, just inform us of what to look out for next, or what the climate science really means in an applied way for the fish, wildlife, and habitat we are responsible for. So, you know, we also look to each other to learn. So we appreciate, you know, just the community of practice that CASC has developed. And, you know, just to keep it brief, to maybe allow time for one question, I'll just say, you know, we're thankful to have the collaboration, the cooperation, and look forward to furthering the discussion in the future.
Thank you so much, Cathy. Well, we do in fact have just a few minutes left to tackle a question. And there are some really great questions in the Q&A, so it's hard to choose here, but I think I'm going to go out, read the very last question that came in. And we'll probably just have about a minute for each panelist to respond if they choose to. So the question is, different climate scientists have different views on how to best handle climate change. For example, some believe pro-forestation is best, while others believe a wide array of forest management techniques is best. How do you balance that? Valerie, you want to give a stab at it?
I will, though I would love to ponder this for a while. So I think for me, it's around exactly what landscape. It's a bit of again, around that landscape, get your partners, talk about what you're trying to achieve there, put in place your goals and then your strategy for achieving those. And I think that balances then some of these competing elements of forest management that I was working on quite a bit, you know, because there are so many differences about, you know, composition and structure of a forest today and in the future, and what we're really trying to do to achieve, you know, a proper forest structure. And monitoring, you know, we can't leave monitoring out of the equation here, and really being thoughtful about monitoring, and then adaptive management, you know, shifting our strategies as our data show that we need to make those shifts.
Thank you, Valerie. Would anyone else like to respond to the question before we end? Jerry.
Well, it's an intriguing question, and my reflections take me back to the point when the Pilgrims arrived in 1619. And so I'd use that as a point where that might be perceived as the way the forests were naturally encountered by the English who came to the Plymouth Rock settlement. But there were indigenous practices of managing forests long before Europeans arrived. And so at what point do we consider the forest natural and the state of the forest today in relation to, say, a timeline that might consider the 1619 timeframe as as a primeval forest, but it was well managed for millennia before then. And so much so that if you read some of the historical accounts about carriages driving through the forests, because of the prescribed burns and the management practices of indigenous peoples. And so today, the notion that how do we manage our forests? I just want to connect that to the long-standing indigenous forest practices, and what can we? The questions are: what are we trying to achieve by managing our forests, and by what methods, and what measures then will we use to determine when we have had success? So these are my thoughts. I don't necessarily have answers, but it's a very thought-provoking question, and I'll rely upon my climate scientists and foresters and land managers for how we go about answering that.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. This has been a wonderful discussion. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone in the audience has too. I actually don't see a way for us to celebrate what a wonderful session this was. So I'm just going to clap and say thank you so much. And I'm sure that there's just a lot of thanks coming from the audience, and folks can feel free to put in the chat if they want to just comment and make our virtual panel feel really good. This is such a hard activity to do in the virtual space because you don't have that room to sort of respond to. So, I just want to thank everyone again for agreeing to do this panel. We really enjoyed your perspectives. And I think we'll probably save the questions that came in through the Q&A for folks to consider. And the chat is just blowing up right now with many thanks. So Jerry, Cathy, Marc, and Valerie, just really wonderful. Thank you again. So now we're going to move to a quick break, a 15-minute break before we start our next session. So please go grab a coffee, get a bio break, whatever you need to do, and join us back at 11:15. We have Science Talks in 2 sessions to choose from: compounding effects of multiple stressors and vulnerability of key resources. And then, of course, there's more talks and workshops later this afternoon after a lunch break, and tomorrow as well. And there, somewhere above all of the thank yous is a link for you to click on, but you can also just go to our website and look for the links for all of the panels and sessions for the rest of our program. And I'm sure someone will stick a link back in the bottom of the chat again for people to access. So we'll see you again in about 15 minutes. Thank you so much.